Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of Governance Watch, a webcast series from the Conference Board, sponsored in collaboration with the law firm of Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen & Hamilton. I'm Paul Washington, Executive Director of the ESG Center here at the Conference Board. The Conference Board is the world's leading nonpartisan think tank serving business and society for over 100 years. And the ESG Center focuses on issues of governance, sustainability, and corporate citizenship and philanthropy. The Conference Board is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and as such, our mission is to serve not only our members, but also society at large. So that's why we're making today's webcast available to the public, and why we have a wealth of resources on our website available regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd encourage all of you to visit our website at www.conference-board.org/COVID-19. You know, with government restrictions lifting around the world, companies are preparing to reopen for business. But this process comes with significant legal risks and governance challenges at the board level and at the management level. So to address those issues, I'm really delighted to be joined by three extraordinary individuals and experts. We've got Mike Ullman, who's General Counsel of Johnson & Johnson. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks. And from the law firm of Cleary, Gottlieb, we have two of their partners who are really focusing on this area. We've got Jennifer Kennedy Park. Welcome, Jennifer. Great. And Michael.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Great. Now, before we begin, I've got a few housekeeping matters to attend to, so please bear with me for a moment. First, you can download the background materials and slide deck for today's presentation in the download section at the bottom of your screen. Please note that you can only access these materials if you're watching this program on a computer. You won't be able to download the materials from a smartphone or tablet. If you would like to receive any of the materials, please fill out your name in the chat box, and we will send them to you after the webcast, even if you're watching on a phone or a tablet right now. Second, we're offering New York State CLE credit for participating in today's live program. For CLE credit, you need to download the CLE verification and CLE evaluation forms, also posted in the download section at the bottom of your screen. Please complete them and email them to our friends at Cleary Gottlieb at the email address provided on the forms. For attorneys seeking credit outside New York, please list your Bar Association information on the verification form, and we'll work on getting you credit in another state. I will provide a verification code later in the webcast, which you will need to write on the verification form to earn credit. For those who want to earn CPE credit, please enter your full name, email address, and specify CPE in the, quote, request CPE credit, end quote, space at the bottom of your screen. Please note that 3 pop-up messages will occur during the program to confirm your participation. Please click OK each time you see one. Third, I want to underscore that, as always, we really welcome audience participation in today's session. You can ask questions at really any time, and we'll try to work them into the conversation as time permits. I note that we have almost 300 people attending, so if we can't get to all your questions, we'll definitely send you an email with an answer afterwards, or if they seem to be of general interest, we'll find a way of posting them for everyone who participated. Finally, a couple other housekeeping matters. Apart from the other forms I mentioned, could you please complete the evaluation form at the end of today's webcast. This is separate from the CLE evaluation form I mentioned. Tells you what you think about the webcast, the audio quality, the moderator, the panelists. Please say nice things because our feelings will get hurt otherwise. But no, in all honesty, we'd like to know what you really think so we can improve our webcast going forward. You can also share this program with your colleagues after the fact, as it should be available on demand in a day or two. And the last note is, if you want to see us even bigger than you can now, you can click on the full screen view by clicking on the 4 arrows in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Okay, so with all that important stuff out of the way, let's turn to the substance of today's conversation. As a threshold question, I'd just like to get a feel for where companies are these days in preparing to reopen. And I think it varies by company, by industry, by geography. Mike, J&J is in a really interesting set of circumstances given the nature of your workforce and your operations. Could you just give us a feel for where you guys are today in terms of getting back up and running?
Sure, Paul. So, the answer to the question as to where are we in reopening is that we've never closed. Because of our manufacturing, operations, facilities, R&D, a very sizable percentage of our population has continued to come to the workplace during the pandemic. And so right now, as we get to the point in time where state, local governments are more welcoming of kind of non-essential or others coming back into the workplace, that we're now planning to bring back the next wave, which is starting to bring back the office-based white-collar professionals as opposed to the manufacturing facilities-based. For us, there's a real sensitivity here, because I think we all know that the question that a lot of people have if they are now coming back to the workplace is it going to be safe? Am I going to be safe? Am I going to be, putting myself, my family at risk? And we have a real sensitivity here that because we've had so many employees continuing to come to work for the last 2 months, that we're not adapting a new standard now that we have the white-collar professionals coming back, right? That our standard has been that any employee coming into the workplace has to be safe, that we have to manage it, and we have through social distancing, through masks. I'm sure we'll be talking about that, on the rest of the webcast. But that's really, we have the spectrum. And then in addition to that, for our sizable workforce in China, right, we already, if you look at the waves, China's in wave 3. Mm-hmm. And so we've gone full cycle. We now have, thousands of employees who are back to the workplace in China. And, we're learning. It helps to kind of be able to learn from what you've seen happen in other places. So it is complex, and to your point, Paul, I think it really does depend upon not only the industry you're in, but where you are geographically. And we're seeing that in the U.S., right, that we have facilities in Ohio and Indiana where we're already back into wave 1, and in New York and New Jersey, we're several weeks away from that.
Right. So, I mean, I know even the name of this webcast is Reopen Ready, but in some ways that just is done from the perspective of folks who are, generally office workers who have been away from the office now. But I think you make an excellent point, which is have a lot of industries, they haven't ever closed, or parts of them have never closed. And so, and that it's happening at different stages in different areas. So this is far from throwing a single switch. So, I guess, Michael, from Cleary's perspective, with your clients, or, where how would you describe where they are? Are a lot of them in J&J situation, in sort of being in multiple different phases in multiple different jurisdictions, or, or how's it playing out among your clients?
Yeah, no, so I think it's we have a broad spectrum, right? We have clients who have both essential and non-essential, and they're very similar to J&J. We have large companies that are well along the way of thinking about office return. We have smaller companies who are just getting geared up now. It does depend on geographic footprint. Obviously, if you're a large international company, you've probably already started along the way. And it's important to learn, as Mike said, from what your experiences have been in those other jurisdictions. I think one of the things that we've encouraged our clients to do is to think about it sooner rather than later. I think at this point, most companies have been thinking seriously about it. A couple of weeks ago, we had some, interesting conversations where people were just not as focused on it. It takes time, right? It takes time to set up PPE, or if you have an open floor plans were the wave of the future 6 months ago, and now that's a hindrance. So it takes time to work these things out. So people need to start, and we've been recommending a task force, multidisciplinary approach where you have, HR, legal, compliance, facilities, to kind of help run this process for you. Those who have the benefit of a medical professional on staff or advisors, that's always something that would be useful. And then we've been advising folks to communicate with your employees. One of the difficult things here, I think, for employees is you may be living the reopening or what's going to happen or what stage is coming next, but often they are not. And a lot of people are anxious and wondering, when am I going back? Am I going back? And so I think communication, even if you don't have the answer early, and we'll talk some about communication, is the right way to go. And the one other point I'll make that I just found interesting from our conversations that Jen and I have been doing a lot of this together, and is you have a lot of companies where, not a lot, but you have a number where we've heard, well, legal compliance wants to kind of slow it down, particularly like, let's say, in Manhattan or New York City. But senior management is anxious to get back into the office. They want to get everyone back in, and I think it's just incumbent on folks to remember not only the risks and the need to be thoughtful here because of the safety and health of your workers, but also the corporate responsibility aspect, because just because you can go in doesn't mean you have to, right? And the more people that you send in, the more crowded the subways are for people who are essential, who need to go in. So it's another thing to balance, and that we've told people, you want to paint that clear picture for your board and your senior management when they're thinking about these issues.
Yeah, I think those are really all important points. I mean, Mike's point about now that you're reopening for your senior management, you can't have a different set of standards than you had for other folks. It can't be, oh, now they care about it. And your point, too, among others, which is, you have to think not only about what your reopening means for your workers and your own company, but what it means about community more broadly, including things like public transportation. Michael, about how long do you think companies should plan? Let's say, maybe there's no ideal timeline here, but about how much time should they lead before they actually can reopen their doors in a way?
I mean, I don't think there's ever too much time. I think you have to start thinking about it now. It will depend, right? It'll depend very much on your location. It'll depend very much on other business issues at play, right? So we as a law firm have been very fortunate in that we have the luxury of being able to work at home quite productively. So the need to get in is not as great. That may not be the case for others. So what I would say is you should start now, and then you'll figure out, right? Like we've had people talk about, and we'll get into these measures, but installing plexiglass or these sorts. I mean, it just takes time to do those orders and do those things. So the sooner you can start, the better.
Yeah, Paul, I would say, the answer to that is, like the answer to the question, when is the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago.
Right.
The best time to have started planning for this was probably January the 1st. Not a lot of people planning for that, but I think it does. We have been planning for this in part because we've had employees on the work site, but in particular in our offices where they've been largely shut. But there are things like the cafeteria. The cafeterias as they've existed are not going to exist in the short term. And there are bathrooms, there's just so many different elements about that it takes a long time to work through. And again, it's you may not have had the luxury of starting 2 or 3 months ago.
Right.
But I think to Michael's point, it really has to be a priority. And to think that you'll be able to start planning today and then have people back in the office right after Memorial Day, I think that's a bit naive.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. So I guess we're lawyers on all here, and so we love policies and plans and things like that. And so I'm wondering, Jen, could you tell us as companies shift toward maybe just call it even a greater reopening, since a lot of them have already had some people on site, what are some of the key policies that companies might not have otherwise had in place, but really ought to have in place to help guide this process?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I think of this like I think of most compliance issues, and I think you should treat it like you would treat most compliance issues, which is you should have a policy and procedure in place for handling your COVID response as you increase your social density at the office. That falls under a broader rubric of communicable disease policies and plans, and some of our clients already had communicable disease policies and procedures in place. Some didn't. This is a bit, unique. This isn't flu, right? This isn't even H1N1. COVID has very unique features about it, and so having a policy and a set of procedures specific to it is very important because how you mitigate this disease is unique. I think there are a couple aspects of how you get that in place if it's not already in place. One, it's got to be in writing. As the litigator in me, right? You want things in writing so that your best exhibit is available. Two, I think you want to think about surveying employees before you put in place the procedures and the plan. I wouldn't recommend, asking them, would you wear a mask, won't you wear a mask? Because you might be allowing them, to think they're going to be able to weigh in on a question that ultimately they're not going to be able to weigh in on. But you want to, I think, gauge the temperature of how comfortable people are returning to the office, if that's an option for them. In part because this is largely about, as I think we've all been saying, communication, right? You want to have effective communication with your workforce. So a survey could be important. And then you want to make sure you've got an employee-facing, document, something that tells your workforce, here's what you have to do, A, B, and C before you show up at work, and here's what you have to do while you're at work, D, E, and F. And then a separate set of procedures that lays out pretty carefully what you as an organization are going to do to make the workplace healthy and safe. I think I read an article this morning that said every business is a health and wellness business now. I think that's really true, and so having the right procedures in place that you are a healthy and well business.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah, I'm not sure how many companies had a detailed communicable disease policy, and now they really ought to have a very specific one, which undoubtedly will, I assume undoubtedly, but would probably need to evolve as our scientific and medical understanding of this disease, develops, right? So what precautions may make sense initially may change over time as we've seen. So I guess you need to have some flexibility built in to adjust it and then really communicate it as you go along and explain why it's changed. But what are some of the, especially for folks, like I worked at a media company, we didn't have a communicable disease policy as far as I know. So what are sort of the key elements of a CDP?
So, Paul, I think you just nailed the first one, right, which is, I think we'd all say flexibility, right? I mean, both the research on this disease is changing quickly, but also the federal and state guidance and laws in this space are rapidly evolving. And so it's important to make sure you're flexible and you're paying attention to those things. Other things to keep in mind when you're putting together a communicable disease policy are phasing. So, who's going to return to the office when and what are your reasons for that? And some of those reasons will involve, whether people are commuting or not, and how comfortable people are commuting, whether people have childcare, responsibilities with school being closed, whether people have pre-existing conditions and need some reasonable accommodations. So that's kind of aspect one, is thinking about who comes to work when. And then how do you, once you decide who's coming to work when, what do you need to do with the physical environment to alter it so that it is healthy and safe and you're mitigating the transmission of the disease? So, what do you need to alter to ensure there's social distancing kept? Do you need to close, Mike was just saying, close cafeterias, right? Do you need to close your cafeteria or your coat room? Do you need to put markers on the ground to ensure people are 6 feet apart from each other? Health and hygiene is another aspect of it. So what are you doing about sanitizer and having sanitizer and cleaning supplies available so you can clean high-touch areas? And building changes are important too. Involving your landlord, if you have one, in these conversations is going to be very, very important for things like ventilation, understanding what you can do about ventilation, and elevators, right? So one of the biggest issues we have in New York City is how do you get people safely into these skyscrapers, so have a plan for that. And then you have to think about once who's going to come in and what are the conditions under which they're allowed to come in. Are you going to screen people? Are you going to do medical questionnaires? Are you going to do temperature screening? If you're going to, do you have any obligations if you're doing temperature screening to make sure you're paying people for the time that they're doing the temperature screening? And then PPE, obviously, right? So are you going to make people wear masks while they're in the office, or otherwise implement physical barriers between people, like Michael was saying, plexiglass? The last aspect of it, I think, has got to be training, monitoring, and enforcement. You're going to have a policy and a procedure. How are you going to make sure that people understand it, and how are you going to make sure that you're complying with it? And recognize that there will be non-compliance. There'll be footfalls, and there'll also probably be people who challenge, right, whether they should have to comply with it or not, both from an employee perspective and from a customer perspective. We're seeing a lot of that now around the country, where customers are resisting communicable disease plans and procedures that companies have implemented. McDonald's, Target, et cetera, are all experiencing that. So what's your realistic plan for dealing with an employee or a customer who doesn't comply with the procedures you put in place?
Yeah, and I think that's really important, because sometimes people want to punt on enforcement and say, oh, we'll enforce it on a case-by-case basis or something like that. But that's not necessarily a great answer. Those are sometimes the hardest questions to answer. And I can see that you could have non-compliance from a couple of perspectives. You could have people who want to be back at work and don't want to be bothered with face masks and don't want to obey the rules. And then you have other people who, no matter how much reassurance you give them about the safety of the workplace, and even if they don't have these other issues like commuting or childcare and so forth, just don't feel comfortable coming back. And those are, I guess, two really, especially the latter, I think, is a really difficult enforcement issue, right? Like, how much choice do you actually leave with your employees as to whether they personally feel comfortable coming back?
Yeah, I think that is a big challenge, and I'd be interested in Michael's perspective on that as well. I mean, I participated in another session like this where someone described the role of being a CEO right now as being the chief empathy officer, which is really understanding what your workforce is feeling and thinking about and being able to empathize with that. And there are lots of steps I think you can take before you get to the point of enforcement, right? But it's just kind of why I was talking about surveys, right? Trying to understand what people's concerns are so that you can be proactive about addressing them. I mean, at the end of the day, yes, like any company policy, you can enforce it and you can discipline. You want to be careful about, whether someone is positioning themselves potentially as a whistleblower, right? Someone who is raising a complaint that the environment is not healthy and safe and that they potentially are being retaliated against for that. But like all policies and procedures, you do have to plan for how you're gonna enforce it.
Yeah. Mike, I
Yeah,
don't
and
know if you have any thoughts about.
Yeah, look,
go ahead, Mike. Sorry.
How about Mike and then Michael?
all right, yes. I think so much of what Jen is talking about is, I think, what we're all dealing with, right? And part of it, just a few things, right? One is things are going to evolve. And I think one of the things that I have found in our organization, people are looking for certainty. And I think that's in part because the last 3 months, the change, the uncertainty that everyone has experienced is somewhat unprecedented. And so our employees are kind of looking to management to tell them, okay, well, here's what's going to happen. And what I tell people is, look, if I had told you 3 months ago that you'd be leaving your house once a week and that, you'd be working from, like, you would have thought it was like a science fiction novel. And yet here we are, because of how quickly whether it's the disease, the incidences, testing, possible treatments are evolving. I think it's really very hard for anyone to predict what the situation will be like in 3 months or 4 months. And so even as we're putting in place the policies and the guidelines for wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, we're very cognizant of the fact that these are going to evolve and that none of these policies will necessarily be set in stone. The other point I'll make, and this is probably, and again, it's dealing with the psychology of, the questions that people have. Am I coming back to the workplace? When am I coming back? One of the things that we are really emphasizing at this point is to be thinking of tasks, not people, right? So that it's not like we're going to take 20% of our workforce and you will be in wave 1. What it is in particular as we start to go back to the office is who needs to be in the workplace on a given day for a given task that can be much better done either in a group meeting or in the office than it can at home. And that we're going to be making these decisions based upon that, and that, I don't think anyone is going to start going back to the office 5 days a week. It's very much, as we go back to this, why do you need to be there on a given day? What can you do that you've not been able to do at home? And to get people to think that way, because I think Michael made a very important point earlier, right, which is every person, whether it's you're commuting or you're coming to work, can be creating a risk for other people, right? And we have employees, whether you're in facilities, security, people who have to be at the workplace. And so it really helps to be able to remind people that, you may be stir crazy at home and looking to have a change of scenery, but that could have impact on other people. And so we have to continue to think as a community. And I think getting back to the empathy point that Jen mentioned, that will kind of require constant messaging on the part of management as to be thinking about, where we are in the process and where we are in the community.
Yeah. So basically it's, to be a successful lawyer, you have to be more than just a lawyer. And this is really when compliance and law are embedded in a broader sense of humanity, right? Probably more so now than others. And I think your point about bringing people back based on the work that needs to be done rather than the job title or job function makes a lot of sense. It also avoids issues of people saying, well, they treated this group of employees this way, we treated this. It actually gives you a nice, it's not always clear, but at least there's a reason that you can relate to everyone, sort of regardless of where they sit in the hierarchy is, yeah, this is why the CEO's in the office these 2 days a week, but the other 3 not, right? And we're requiring you to be in 1 week or 4 days or whatever it might be. It's because of the work that's involved. Michael, did you have something you wanted to?
No, I mean, I think we can move on. I think that point that you just made was an important one about how you can manage some of the discriminatory risks that you might face when you're choosing who comes in. But I think we can move on.
Got it. Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit about the board of directors, because we're talking about the legal and the governance aspects here. And so just generally speaking, Michael, maybe you can lead us off, what's the role that you would advise the board taking in this? Does the board adopt the CDP, the communicable disease or COVID-19 policy? Do they delegate it to management? You know, if it's evolving, you know, what's the right role for the board in adopting policies, monitoring those policies, adopting plans? How engaged do you think they should be? Where should they put their efforts?
So I think, right, there's two things on the board that I want to make, 2 points. The first, just to pick up on what Mike was talking about and Jen with the empathy, right, the board is going to be an important aspect of tone at the top, right, so you're going to want to make sure that the board is thinking about these issues and is aligned with management and the right cultural aspects are incorporated into stakeholder communications. In terms of your more specific question about the board's role in the policy and the procedures, I mean, to me, it's a classic Caremark case. I think, right, the board needs to balance its duty of oversight and information versus the fact that management is responsible for running the day-to-day operations of the business. Obviously, with this pandemic and reopening offices or, you know, ramping up operations, it's a big mission-critical risk that's at play here with health and safety. And so I think, right, that the board, I don't know that they formally need to adopt the policy, but I think the board's going to want to make sure that there's adequate information reporting systems with management, that there's regular reporting. Again, I mean, it comes down to communication is key. You want to have that avenue open between management and the board. The board's going to want to regularly monitor what's going on. It's going to want to look at management's planning, its plans for reopening the office. It's, you know, it will want to look at this policy, and it's going to want to assess what it thinks management has done. You want a pressure test, right? So if there's something that you see there that you don't quite, you know, you bring your diversity of experience as a board member, and if you see something that you have a question about, you question it. And then you also make sure you get follow-up, right? You don't want to just leave it with the question. And so I think, you know, I don't want to be Chicken Little and say that Caremark claims are going to come back rampantly. It's still a very hard standard to meet for a plaintiff to prove a Caremark claim. The language from Caremark is, you know, utterly fail to implement information and reporting or consciously fail to monitor. Those are tough standards, but I think boards are going to really want to step up the engagement on this and at least be sure that they're aware of what's going on and that they're pressure testing where appropriate, and perhaps most importantly, that they're documenting it in minutes, right? You want to have that record. You know, we've had a few cases survive now, the motion to dismiss on Caremark in the last few years, and the Bluebell ice cream case is one where, you know, there was an utter lack of information provided to the board on the listeria testing. So I think you're going to want that, you know, and there was no documentation in the board minutes. At least that's what the court found. So I think you're going to want to make sure that you're documenting this all as well as you go through this process.
Right, and it's not only because of the legal risk here, obviously, but it's because it's also the right thing to do, right? Because you're facing scrutiny from not just potentially the plaintiff's bar, but you've got to do right by your employees and by your customers and by your own conscience here. So I think that's all great advice. Mike, in terms of your perspective on the role of the board, and we'll get into sort of the workload of the board in a moment, but how do you figure out, or how does your board figure out how engaged they want to be on a topic like this?
Look, I think what I would say, and you know, this is clearly a case where, you know, one answer does not fit all. I think there are so many variables here. You know, a lot depends upon what industry you're in. So what I've seen is like the retail industry, business was down 90% in the month of April. So I think that, you know, if you're on the board of a retailer with that kind of a business consequence, that's very different than if you're on the board of a company where, you know, business results may actually be improving because of the pandemic. You know, you also have, for example, again with retailers, as they reopen, there's a whole element of customers that can be at risk there. Whereas if you're in a business maybe that relies more on e-commerce, then again, very different set of factors. So I think that there's a lot of elements that have to kind of weigh in to how involved the board needs to be. Now, that being said, look, there's a threshold, and I see this not only in our board, but a couple of the nonprofits where I sit on a board, and certainly, the amount of meetings or phone calls that we have has increased significantly, and I think that's appropriate, and that I do think kind of what Michael said about the communication is really important. And so I think that one of the things that we're doing is using the existing committee structure that we have to address, right? So financial risk, the audit committee, non-financial risk, our compliance committee. And so I think that, most boards, at least of larger companies, do have the committee structure in place where, you can get as much done through committee meetings, special meetings of the committees, than needing to get the entire board together, but you still need to do that as well.
Yeah, so this is a real, it's one reason why, although this is unprecedented, at least at larger companies, we aren't seeing this at the smaller members of the Russell 3000, but the larger companies generally have the infrastructure in place to handle this. Some companies have special committees, but many, you've got a lead independent director or board chair who can serve as the principal liaison. You've got the different committees in place who can add this into their workload. You've got the capacity to do special reports for your board. It's harder if you're resource constrained as a smaller company. But I sort of wonder though, does this cause you as a general counsel to work with your boss and with the board members and committee chairs to say, okay, what is it that we can actually take off your agenda right now that wasn't urgent, and so we can really focus more on this? Because you can't do everything, right? Or you can't do everything well.
Yeah. No, look, I do think that if I look at our committee meetings, our board meetings, the agendas are reflecting the COVID situation that we have, right? And so there's no question that if you look at our annual cycle of agenda items that we would have at our upcoming board meeting, right? The agenda items are going to be different than that, right? And I think that certainly it's not that you necessarily have to take things off the plate, because, it does tend to be incremental, right? That's but I think really it's more, Paul, is how are you going to spend your meeting time? Because I think that really does become the priority, and I don't think there's any question that the whole range of the spectrum of risks that all companies are facing, regardless of size, is where I think inevitably boards are going to want to be spending the meeting time together talking about. But I don't think you can necessarily say, well, we don't have to do, take something that maybe is not related. We don't have to do that this year.
Yeah, because you can get in trouble for not doing that later on too, right? Yeah.
It's largely incremental, I think, but again, it's how are you going to spend your in-person time?
Okay, that's really helpful. Before we get into legal risks in a bit more detail, Michael, just a quick question for you or for Jen. Is there any reason for a board not to adopt the CDP? That's one of the questions we got in from the audience. It seems like a pretty good thing for the board to bless and maybe delegate to a committee or to management to amend the policy over time. Any reason not to have the board adopt such a policy?
So obviously, Jen, welcome your views, but I don't see a reason not to do it.
Okay.
I just think, right, a part of it from my perspective is when I talk about the board doesn't need to, it's just the sense of how comfortable the board feels. I mean, and maybe this is part of the question they want to ask themselves, right, that they want to get comfortable enough where they can adopt the policy. I don't think it's required, and I wouldn't say that that's prima facie evidence of the board not having done its duties, but I also don't have a strong reason why they ought not to do that.
Got it.
Yeah,
okay.
I think it's a question to your point, Paul, of flexibility. So, even if you're delegating to a committee or to management, changing it, you have to recognize this is a policy that is likely to change rapidly and often. And so how are you going to manage the sort of change control process over something like this?
Got it. Okay, thanks. So let's turn a little more deeply to talk about some of the legal and then the non-legal risks that companies are facing in this various stages of reopening. So under the heading of legal risks, I mean, we've heard some of our members who are concerned about the legal issues with having some employees return to the office sooner than others. We touched on that a bit earlier. But also the legal issues relating to doing health checks on your employees. Can you require your hourly employees to check their health at home? What's your ability legally to check them at the office? How do you control that, the disclosure or lack thereof of that information? How do you deal with telling people, well, this person can't come to the office because they're sick, or what are some of the main legal risks that companies are facing now, and how do they even begin to deal with them? Jen, that's a big one, I know. Can you take a stab at it?
I mean, I guess we could try to put it into a couple buckets. So, there's a bucket of legal risk around violations of law and regulation. So, there are an evolving set of laws that are applicable to this situation, regulations that are applicable to this situation, and so you have to pay attention to those. For example, and this isn't directly about employees, but some states require that you publish your plan for dealing with return to office. So you have to make sure you're looking at those, but we've also been hearing both at the federal and at the state level that the health and safety administrations or departments are going to vigorously, be paying attention to whether guidance has been complied with. So there's that area. The second area is the sort of negligence area, and that's both for employees and for anyone who comes on your premises, right? So you have a non-waivable duty to make your premises safe. That applies to your employees, it applies to your customers, it applies to vendors, contractors, and so you have to act reasonably, right, in order to defend against those kind of claims. But those are, I think, a big concern for people, in part because an active plaintiff's bar, might find those sorts of claims attractive. And that's why we're hearing now, both at the federal and state level, debates about whether there should be liability shields in the current environment, right? So should we be making sure that workers' compensation is the avenue for seeking redress for employees who get sick on the job from COVID? Should we have tort reform, right? Should there be certain industries that are exempted from having liability for COVID-related illnesses, including, like New York, it's healthcare, but you could envision it being broader than that as well. Then the other bucket, and Paul, these are the buckets you were focusing on, is around discipline, right, and enforcement of your policies. And so what can employees do or allege about their requirements to comply? So you could envision things like wrongful termination claims. You could envision things like retaliation claims of people positioning themselves as whistleblowers, discrimination claims because someone was not given reasonable accommodation or was not permitted to return to the office. We've actually had some clients who are willing to take the risk of discrimination claims because they don't want certain vulnerable populations to be returning to the office, and so they're willing to accept some legal risk there. There's privacy issues. So to the extent you are now screening and taking people's temperatures, you have obligations both at the state and the federal level to make sure that that information is kept separate from an employee's work file and that it is retained and protected confidentially. So, if someone gets sick in the office and you want to talk to people they've been in close contact with, for example, right, to say you've been in contact with someone who's tested positive for COVID, you don't want to be telling them who that was, right, because you want to make sure you're complying with privacy laws. And then, of course, there's issues with respect to collective bargaining agreements and dealing with labor unions, which I was alluding to before when I was saying if you're going to be asking employees who are subject to those agreements, who are paid on an hourly basis, to take some steps before they come into the workplace such as filling out a questionnaire, taking their temperature, maybe waiting in a lobby for a while before they have any of those things done. You have to figure out how you're going to pay them for that time to avoid wage claims that might come up. That's a lot, right, to process, and it seems like a lot of legal risk, and I think it is, but I think the best defense to any of that is to be, looking at best practices and guidance from your industries, to be talking. I'm sure Mike is doing this, talking to general counsels at other organizations that are similarly situated to hear what they're doing, to make sure you've got written documentation of any decisions that you're making. But the message is, there's a lot of risk here. We're in uncharted territories, but acting reasonably, I think, goes a long way towards mitigating those risks.
Yeah, and I think
what I would,
yeah, go on.
What I would add, though, right, and I totally, what Jen is saying is what I'm hearing from general counsels, right, a lot of companies that I'm talking to. But I do think this kind of relates to something we talked about earlier, right, which is the importance of communication, of engaging your employees. Because, look, there's some inevitability of some liability of some lawsuits that will happen. But I think, I think that if you're any company, right, if we're out and have been communicating with our employees, being transparent, one of the things that we've tried to do over the course of the last 2 months is probably every week, either like our CEO has had a town hall with, we have well over 100,000 employees, and then every executive committee member has done a town hall with theirs. So almost every week that's gone by, each of our employees has been included in a town hall. We've taken them on the journey with us. And every step of the way, we've been talking about, here's where we are, here's what we're seeing, here's where we're going. Look, at the end of the day, no policy that you have and however you look to enforce it, you're going to end up with some potential litigation. But I think that a process that's relying heavily on employee engagement and communication will go a long way to minimizing that.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And let me ask, because it relates to, I think the point you're making, that you can't over-rotate and just have the lawyers, especially risk-averse lawyers, dictate everything you're doing, because you cannot eliminate risk here, and you've got to balance it with all these other factors. So when it comes to making decisions about these issues, I think Michael mentioned having, some form of a crisis management team. Like, I think we did a survey recently. I think 80% of the companies we surveyed have a crisis management team in place, or it depends. The larger companies, it's more like 90%. Do you guys see having the same kind of folks during this phase on your crisis management team as you had on your earlier phase? I mean, I'm just wondering, as you get into reopening, do you broaden the group of people who are involved in weighing in on these fundamental issues of what your communicable disease policy should be, how you address these specific legal risks with whatever actions you might take? I'm just wondering if you think the composition of that group needs to somehow evolve.
So the one thing, to the extent that you have not, you're not an essential workplace, and you are now in the position of returning to the office for the first time, one of the things I've actually seen, and I think is really important, is you have to have your facilities people intimately involved in this planning process, because they know who's coming in, who's coming out, what your square footage looks like, where your stairwells are, all of these things that go into your policies and procedures. And they might not have been part of your leave the office team, originally. So I would include them as critical elements of this.
Right. All the aspects of facilities too, right? Whether including cafeteria and so forth. Let me pause here for a second for their CLE code announcement. The verification code for those who need it is 12106. That's 12106. Okay, with that brief commercial interruption, Mike, could you talk about, I mean, we've touched on it, but a little bit about the main non-legal risks that companies need to be dealing with now? And I guess strikes me that some of them might be relating to making sure your employees and your customers, feel comfortable coming back. But just wondering the big ones that you think boards need to be thinking.
Yeah, look, I think this has been such an emotional period of time for people, and I think that whether it's customers coming back or your employees or as we deal with stakeholders, that's important to realize. One of the things that we haven't mentioned that I think is really important here is mental health. Mm-hmm. And I think that, there's so many components of that, and we have been hearing this a lot from our employees, right? There's stress just because there's a global pandemic, right? There's mm-hmm. stress there. Many people are dealing with children home from school. They're dealing with elder care issues. They're dealing with relatives who may be somewhat immune compromised. So this is not an easy period of time for people. And so I do think that, it kind of gets back a little bit to the employee engagement, and the empathy, right, which is that we've talked about, but just that understanding that you can't just expect, people to show up in the office one day and everything is back to the way it was. And I think that will be another important part. And I mention that only because, we tend to not always give full recognition of the importance of mental health and stress and what that really means to how people do in the workplace and the comfort level that they have in coming back to work. So I think certainly that is one non-legal risk that we need to be thinking about. I think a second one is, just in general, which is what kind of changes is this going to bring for the long term? Mm-hmm. And you hear people talking about what will the office of the future look like. Many of us who are like diehards, I have to be in the office 5 days a week, have kind of realized, I don't need to be in the office 5 days a week. I don't need to be there so I can print out every 100-page document. And I think that there's a lot of changes that many of us have adapted to. And look, we know that, people's comfort level and change can be very different. And so I think recognizing the fact that it's not going back to the workplace, it's going to be a while before things get back to normal, right? And that's the question that I know I get a lot from our employees, right? Well, when will things go back to the way they were? And the answer may be never, right? But that's not the answer people want to hear. And so I think that emotional aspect is really going to be important because you need your employees to feel stable and confident for the benefit of your business, right? There's obviously a human element of it, but it's also very important for your business. Your employees are the people out in touch with your clients, with your customers. And so I think all of that is I think we have to have a very holistic approach to how we continue to handle this.
Yeah, both internally and, externally with various other stakeholders as well, as was pointed out earlier. I think that's a really important point. Conscious of time, I think we talked a decent amount about communication and the importance of it, and not just, hey, we're through the crisis, we dealt with stuff, now we can shut down. No, sometimes we're required to report in some jurisdictions about your opening up plans. We talked about employees. Clearly, investors are interested in that too. But let me try to wrap up with maybe three sort of quick questions here. Mike, again to you as General Counsel, what are the main lessons you've learned in the last couple months that you would want to apply to this reopening phase and that you'd suggest that others do as well?
It's probably points that I've mentioned, right? But just, first of all, you kind of have to manage this for the long term. It's not going to be over in a couple of months. I think, secondly, thinking about what's best for your employees and your other stakeholders. But at the end of the day, your employees are the conduits to your other stakeholders. Kind of communicating, taking people along for the journey, and then really just understanding that the situation is going to continue to change, that we may not have the certainty. And maybe the one other thing I would add is really relying on experts, and that, recognizing that in this case, the medical experts, the various functional people that all bring something to the table. I think that's kind of among the things, the lessons learned that we'll need to continue to apply in the coming months.
Yeah, right. Reliance and openly and actively inviting expertise that you may not have normally brought into your boardroom or into your management meetings. Michael, Jen, any thoughts as to main lessons from the last couple months?
I mean, for me, I think I think Mike summed it up quite nicely. I do, right? I think people just need to be thoughtful, and I know that time is not necessarily a luxury, but we have to be thoughtful and thorough as we look through this, and and think hard about these issues. And I've seen people rush this process, and there's no easy answers here, and you want to absorb the information out there. And the fact that we have a myriad of standards, it's not going to be easy, right? If you're operating in one state, it's hard enough. If you're operating in multiple states, it gets even harder. And then obviously if you're across the globe, just in terms of the restrictions on what you can and cannot do. So I think people just need to be patient and absorb as much as they can the information that's out there, and be flexible, and be able to pivot, because that's going to be a requirement here. One day masks are no good, and then the next day masks are, the holy grail. So it just requires a lot of,
Right. And Jen, maybe get into the next last question, which is, your biggest concerns. And it seems to me that Michael's just highlighted one big concern is the lack of consistency in guidance, both even at the same time and then over time from government agencies. Any other major concerns you have during this reopening phase?
I mean, I'm always concerned about the unknown unknowns, which, this is really kind of emphasized for all of us. But I think another big area, and this has been alluded to, I think, in some of the questions we've been getting, is privacy and confidentiality, right? Especially here in the United States, in some other jurisdictions that have GDPR and are more comfortable, right, with having high volumes of private information. I think we're moving to a space where businesses here in the United States are going to be increasingly collecting information that is highly sensitive and are not used to that. And that's happening at a time where we have increased focus on what are our privacy rights as citizens. So I think that's something to pay close attention to and to think about carefully.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent insight. Go on, Michael.
Although one thing, sorry, I was just going to say one quick thing on that, not to disagree with Jen, because she's my teammate in all this, but one thing on privacy that concerns me, if you look at the European perspective, is the inflexibility and the inability to do a lot of things that folks think are smart to do in terms of ensuring people don't have temperatures or screening questionnaires. And there's a lot of concern in the EU that some of those measures won't be available to folks without a lot of risk. So I get a little concerned that you get
but
caught
it's
on
definitely
both
an
ends
area
with the
that we at the
privacy
conference board are going to be taking a deeper look at, because it's one of those things that thus far has not been high on board agendas during this pandemic, but I definitely think it's going to move right up there as they're collecting a lot of sensitive medical information, and there's a cyber aspect to this as well. So that's a great insight for the future. Let me conclude with the last question really quickly. What gives you confidence that we'll be able to tackle these tricky legal and governance issues as we go forward? Maybe start with you, Michael, and then Mike, and then Jen.
So for me, I think it's just seeing and speaking with our clients and how focused people are that this is an employee health and safety concern, the reopening aspect of it first and foremost. And the Business Roundtable statement on purpose that predates this, I think, is a pretty good, it's almost eerie when it came out how much it foreshadows what we're going through now, and the focus on, investor and other stakeholder engagement, the importance of human capital management. And so I think just the focus of key business luminaries in that respect is they were a little bit ahead of the game, and so I think that's helped, and we've seen that, at least in the advice we've been giving in the conversations we've had, play through, that's what people are
Mike,
most focused on.
Look, I think science and medicine will win out in the end, and it's just a question of time, and maybe not in that. Ultimately, you have the science and medicine, and then I think secondly, for me personally, working at a healthcare company, I think we have the benefit of highly motivated employees. I've seen people rise to the occasion. People are really excited about feeling that they can be a part of a solution. They can be part of bringing, healthcare solutions to people around the world. And so just seeing the spirit of our team on a global basis, and regardless of their position, but feeling that they're really that sense of purpose and mission, I think it makes you really have all the confidence that you need that people want to be part of this, and that's what's motivating them.
Yeah, I think we're saying, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, both of you. Jen, final word on this?
I mean, I would just say I'm amazed every day at how adaptable we all are. All businesses are, and just as people we are, all are. If you told me that Cleary Gottlieb would have gone to fully remote in 24 hours, on 24 hours notice, I would have told you that would never happen, and we would need months of planning to make that work. And we did it, and lots of other organizations have done it. And just at a personal level, the number of us who are now teaching our small children at home, and our small children are adapting to learning in a new environment. We are all incredibly adaptable. It's real testament to the human character of all of us.
Yeah, so the broader perspective that Michael mentioned, the sense of purpose that Mike mentioned, and the adaptability and resilience that I think you've all touched on, Jen, that's reason to give us some confidence as we're addressing something that's clearly got a lot of legal issues, and we'll be doing more on best practices in the legal areas that you mentioned in particular, Jen. But it's not just a legal challenge. This is a real holistic human challenge that we're facing. So I want to thank you all for a really thoughtful discussion today. As I mentioned at the outset, the Conference Board has a lot of resources on this, so please visit our pandemic. There's an excellent deck that Cleary prepared that you can download. We also have a deck that Dick has additional resources that the Conference Board has, a number of reports you may find interesting. Please, if you've got the time now, complete an evaluation form for this webcast. And I just want to thank our panelists again, and thank all of you for attending today. Be safe, be well, and see you again soon.
Thanks.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.